The farmer heard the little boy before he saw him. The crying was faint, almost lost beneath the howl of the Wyoming wind. Elias Cooper pulled his wagon to a stop and listened. The sound came again, a child, somewhere near the abandoned stagecoach road. Nobody traveled that road in winter, not unless they had nowhere else to go. Elias climbed down from the wagon and lifted his lantern. Snow swept across the prairie in long white ribbons, and the sun had nearly disappeared behind dark storm clouds. Another blizzard was coming, the kind that buried fences, the kind that killed cattle, the kind that left travelers frozen where they fell. The crying came again, this time closer. Elias followed the sound through knee-deep snow, 20 yards, 30, and then he saw them. A broken wagon wheel jutted from a drift. Beside it sat two children. A little girl slept against her brother's shoulder. The boy couldn't have been older than 10. His coat was torn, his boots were soaked, his face was red from windburn. But he was awake, watching, waiting. The moment he spotted Elias, he jumped to his feet and picked up a stick, against a grown man, against a 6-foot farmer, against the entire Wyoming territory. Elias stopped walking. The boy's hands were shaking violently and his lips had turned blue, but he still raised the stick. "Stay back," he said. His voice cracked. Elias slowly lifted both hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." The boy didn't lower the stick. The little girl stirred. "Jacob," she murmured. "It's okay," the boy said, never looking away from Elias. "We don't need anything." Elias studied him. The child was starving, exhausted, half frozen, yet somehow still proud. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy hesitated, then answered, "Jacob." He pointed behind him to his sister Emma, who opened her large brown eyes far too tired for someone so young. Elias glanced between them and asked where their parents were. Everything changed. Jacob looked away immediately. The wind whistled through the broken wagon wheel, and Emma lowered her head. Neither child spoke. Finally, Jacob answered in words that came out flat, practiced, like he'd repeated them many times already. "They died 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks alone, 3 weeks in a Wyoming winter. The math didn't make sense. No children survived that long out here, not in January, yet somehow these two had. When Elias asked how, Jacob looked toward the distant hills and answered simply, "We kept moving." The answer somehow made it worse, not because it explained anything, but because it explained everything. They had survived because they never stopped, never stayed long enough to freeze, never stayed long enough to starve completely. Just kept moving, day after day, mile after mile, like two tiny ghosts wandering across the frontier. They were headed to Montana, Jacob said, where their uncle lived. He didn't know where exactly, didn't have an address. Emma looked embarrassed, like she knew how impossible that sounded. Elias stared at them. The nearest Montana settlement was hundreds of miles away. These children weren't traveling to Montana, they were walking toward a hope, and hope wasn't enough to survive a Wyoming winter. A gust of wind slammed into them, and Emma shivered violently. For the first time, Jacob looked scared, though not for himself, for her. He immediately moved in front of his sister, shielding her from the wind, and Elias noticed that everything the boy did revolved around protecting her. Every movement, every decision, every breath. When Elias asked how long since they'd eaten, neither child answered. That silence told him enough. He walked back toward his wagon, and Jacob immediately tightened his grip on the stick. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Elias ignored the question, opened a storage box, and pulled out 2 blankets, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, and a container of beef stew. When Emma saw the food, her eyes widened, and so did Jacob's, but neither child moved, neither child asked. That hurt almost as much as their condition. Hungry children usually begged. These children had been hungry so long they'd stopped asking. Elias walked back and held out the stew. Emma looked at Jacob, waiting, always waiting. Jacob swallowed hard, then nodded once. Only then did she take it, holding the container with both hands like it was made of gold. For a moment nobody spoke. The wind howled around them and snow drifted across the road. Then Emma whispered something so quietly Elias almost missed it. "Jacob gave me his food." The boy's face immediately reddened. "Emma," he said, a warning in his voice. But she pointed at him and said it was true. He had kept saying he wasn't hungry. Elias looked at the boy, who looked away, and suddenly Elias understood. Jacob hadn't survived because he was strong. He had survived because he loved his sister more than himself. The realization hit harder than it should have, because 8 years earlier Elias had buried his wife, and 6 months after that he had buried the child she never got to meet, a daughter born too early, too small, too fragile. The farmhouse had been quiet ever since. Too quiet. He looked at the two children standing in the snow, then at the storm rolling across the prairie, then at the dark sky above. He knew exactly what he should do. Take them to town, find the sheriff, let someone else deal with it. That was the sensible choice, the safe choice, the smart choice. Instead, he heard himself say, "Get in the wagon." Jacob immediately shook his head. "We don't take charity." Elias almost laughed. The kid was freezing to death and still arguing. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering supper." Emma looked up instantly. "Supper," he nodded. Hot stew, warm beds, a roof that didn't leak. The little girl looked at her brother, and for the first time all afternoon uncertainty appeared on Jacob's face, not because he didn't want help, but because he desperately did. The storm chose that moment to grow louder, blasting snow across the road and dropping visibility until the world became white. Elias looked toward the horizon, then back at the children, and a terrible thought crossed his mind. If he rode away right now, if he left these children here, neither one would survive until morning. And deep down he knew it. So did Jacob. The ride to Elias Cooper's farm took nearly an hour, and the storm worsened with every mile. Snow hammered the wagon, and the horses struggled through drifts that reached their knees. Emma fell asleep beneath the blankets almost immediately. Jacob didn't. The boy sat upright the entire journey, watching, listening, waiting. Every time Elias glanced back, Jacob's eyes were already on him, like he expected the farmer to change his mind, like kindness was something temporary, something dangerous. Elias had seen that look before, mostly in stray dogs, never in children. When the farmhouse finally appeared through the snow, Emma woke. A warm yellow glow shone from the windows, smoke curled from the chimney, and the barn stood solid against the storm. To most people it was an ordinary farm, but to those children it probably looked like a castle. "You live here?" Emma asked. "I do," Elias answered. "It's big," she said, and he smiled slightly. "It gets smaller when you're fixing the roof." Emma almost laughed, almost, and the sound surprised all three of them. Inside, warmth wrapped around them immediately. The fire crackled, the smell of beef stew filled the kitchen, and fresh bread sat cooling on the counter. Emma simply stared. Jacob stared too. Neither child moved, like they weren't quite sure they were allowed to enter. Elias hung his coat by the door and said, "Come on." The children stepped inside slowly, carefully, as if the entire place might disappear. A few minutes later they sat at the kitchen table. The first bowl of stew disappeared quickly, the second even faster, and by the third bowl Emma's eyelids kept closing. Her spoon slipped from her fingers. Jacob caught it before it hit the floor, and then quietly slid half his bread onto her plate. Elias noticed. Emma noticed too. "Jacob," she said softly. "It's okay," he answered. "You always do that," she insisted, and the boy looked embarrassed. Elias looked away. Something about the moment felt too private, like watching a family from a distance. The realization surprised him, because that was exactly what they were. A family. A very small one, but a family nonetheless. After supper, Elias showed them the spare room upstairs. It hadn't been used in years, and dust covered the dresser, but a quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed. Emma climbed onto the mattress immediately, then froze. Her small fingers touched the blanket. "Is this really ours?" The question hit harder than it should have. Elias cleared his throat. "For tonight." Emma smiled, a real smile, the first one he'd seen, then curled beneath the blankets and was asleep within seconds. Jacob remained standing, watching, always watching. "You can sleep too," Elias told him. The boy nodded but didn't move. Finally he asked, "Why are you helping us?" Elias wasn't prepared for the question. Most children would have simply accepted it, not Jacob. Jacob needed a reason, a guarantee, something he could trust. The problem was Elias didn't have a good answer. After a long silence, he said, "Because somebody should." Jacob studied him carefully, then nodded once, like he had decided that answer was acceptable. Before entering the room, he stopped. "My father said good men are rare," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think he was wrong." Then he closed the door, and for the first time in many years, the farmhouse didn't feel empty. The next morning began with shouting, not inside the house, but outside. Elias stepped onto the porch and immediately spotted 3 riders approaching through the snow. The sheriff and 2 men he didn't recognize. His stomach tightened instantly. The sheriff was not a nervous man, which made his obvious discomfort all the more worrying. One of the strangers stepped forward, well-dressed, expensive coat, expensive boots, no snow on his gloves despite the storm, the kind of man who paid others to do difficult things. "My name is Walter Briggs," he said. Something about the man immediately felt wrong, the smile, the eyes, the way he carried himself, like everything around him already belonged to him. "They were looking for 2 children," he said pleasantly, "a boy named Jacob and a girl named Emma." At that exact moment, the farmhouse door opened behind Elias, and Jacob stepped onto the porch. The instant he saw Walter Briggs, all color drained from his face. The boy actually stumbled backward. Elias noticed. So did Walter, and suddenly Walter's smile changed, colder, sharper, more dangerous. "There you are," he said. Jacob grabbed the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. Emma appeared behind him, and the moment she saw Walter she hid instantly, not shy, but terrified, consumed by pure terror. Elias felt something cold settle into his stomach, because children didn't react like that for no reason. Walter stepped closer, explaining pleasantly that he had come to take them home, but Jacob laughed, a short, broken laugh, and said no. The word hung in the cold air. Walter's eyes narrowed. "No," Jacob then said 3 words that stopped everyone cold. "You burned it." Silence, complete silence, and even the wind seemed to stop. The sheriff looked shocked. Emma began crying immediately, and Walter's pleasant expression vanished for just a second, only a second, but Elias saw it. In that moment he understood. The fire that killed their parents had not been an accident, and whatever really happened that night, Walter Briggs was terrified these children might tell someone. Walter recovered quickly, his smile returning though less convincingly than before. Jacob kept talking, describing how Walter had come to their farm that night, how he had argued with their father, ignoring Emma's frightened grip on his sleeve. Walter remained calm, too calm, like a man who had practiced staying calm, warning Jacob to be careful with the stories he told. The sheriff, looking trapped between truth and consequences, asked everyone to slow down. Walter adjusted his gloves and announced that regardless, the children belonged with him now, pulling a folded document from his coat. He'd been appointed legal guardian. He said, everything perfectly legal, signed by Judge Harrison. Jacob insisted his father had never signed it, and Walter's jaw tightened only slightly, but Elias caught it. Elias took the paper and read it. He wasn't a lawyer, but he could read, and the document looked official enough, signatures, dates, a county stamp. Yet Jacob's reaction told a different story. The boy looked horrified, and when Walter stepped forward suggesting they continue this conversation somewhere private, it was Elias who answered. "No." He told Walter he could leave, that while the children stood on his property, the decision was his to make. Walter smiled a dangerous smile and warned him he was making a mistake, then turned to the sheriff. Before riding away, he looked directly at Jacob, then Emma, then Elias, and said something that made Elias' blood run cold. Children should be careful with secrets. The sheriff lingered after Walter rode away. He looked exhausted, older than he had an hour earlier, and when Elias pressed him, the truth came out slowly. Walter Briggs owned half the county, the grain mill, the bank, the freight contracts, most of the land east of town, and half the people in town owed him money. Everyone was afraid of him. The night of the fire, the sheriff had never believed it was an accident, but the only witness was a 10-year-old boy, and Walter was already telling everyone the family had left lanterns burning. By the time the sheriff arrived, parts of the scene had already been cleaned up by someone neither man needed to name. The sheriff put his hat back on and said quietly that if he were Elias, he'd keep the children close. Men like Walter Briggs didn't come all this way for children they didn't care about. They came for children who knew something. The sheriff rode away, leaving Elias alone on the porch with snow falling harder and the storm swallowing the horizon. Inside the farmhouse, Jacob stood by the window, watching, waiting, afraid. And for the first time since finding the children, Elias Cooper realized something. This wasn't about giving two orphans a place to sleep. This was a fight. And whether he wanted it or not, he was already in it. That night, nobody slept well. The storm battered the farmhouse, wind rattled the windows, and snow piled against the walls. Elias sat alone beside the fireplace, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, his thoughts returning again and again to the same question: what had Jacob seen? Footsteps creaked above him, and a moment later Jacob appeared at the bottom of the stairs, looking exhausted but completely awake, as if sleep had become impossible. They sat across from each other with only the fire crackling between them, and eventually Elias said, "The sheriff thinks you saw something." Jacob stared into the flames. "You don't have to tell me," Elias added. "I just want to help." Another long silence followed, and then Jacob spoke very quietly. The fire wasn't the first thing. He told the story from the beginning. 3 weeks earlier, Walter Briggs had arrived at their farm with two men, big, mean men who never smiled, and Jacob's father had argued with Walter outside the barn for nearly an hour. Jacob wasn't supposed to hear it, but he did, because children hear everything. They were talking about land, their land. Walter wanted it, and Jacob's father refused, told him to leave. Walter got angry, and before he left he said that people who stood in his way didn't stay standing long. A week later Walter returned alone. The argument was even worse, and before leaving he made another threat. Jacob remembered every word. "If I can't buy it, I'll take it." Then came the fire. Jacob's voice grew distant as he described waking to Emma's crying, the strange smell of smoke, his father running outside and shouting, the barn already burning. And then he described the rider he had seen leaving, a rider on a black horse, the only black horse like that in the county. Walter Briggs. No doubt. Then a small voice came from the staircase, Emma, holding her blanket, tears filling her eyes. "He's going to find us," she said. Jacob jumped up immediately. "No," he insisted. "He always finds us," Emma cried. Jacob wrapped his arms around her, and the sight broke something inside Elias, because these weren't children worried about the future. They were children living inside fear, every single day, every single night, every single mile. Elias slowly stood, walked to the front door, opened it, and stared into the storm. The snow whipped across the farm, and the darkness stretched forever. Somewhere out there was Walter Briggs, rich, powerful, connected, and completely convinced that fear would win. Elias looked back at the children, then into the storm again, and quietly said, "Not this time." Because for the first time since his wife died, Elias Cooper had something worth fighting for, and he intended to fight. Walter Briggs moved faster than Elias expected. 3 days later, the attack came, not with guns, not with threats, but with papers. A deputy arrived just after sunrise, his face miserable, which told Elias everything he needed to know. The document was a custody petition, official, signed by Judge Harrison, requesting immediate custody of Jacob and Emma, with the hearing scheduled for the next morning. Less than 24 hours away. Inside the farmhouse, Jacob had already figured it out, and when Elias handed him the paper, the boy's face went pale. Emma looked between them, and when nobody answered immediately, the little girl started crying, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the kind of crying children do when they're exhausted, the kind that hurts worse. That afternoon, Elias rode into town. Inside the courthouse, he found Sheriff Dawson, looking tired and older than usual. Walter had filed, the sheriff confirmed. And when Elias asked if he would help, the sheriff looked away. Judge Harrison and Walter had known each other 20 years. Inside the courthouse entrance, an elderly woman stood watching them, gray hair, sharp eyes, black dress, the kind of woman who looked like she had spent her entire life correcting people. "Margaret Bell," she said, extending her hand. Retired schoolteacher. She had taught Walter Briggs, which meant she knew exactly what kind of man he was. She turned to Elias and asked directly whether the children trusted him. When he said he thought so, she nodded. Good, because you're going to need them tomorrow. Walter's strongest weapon wasn't money, she explained. It was fear. Everyone knew what he was, but nobody said it. Find someone willing to speak, she told him. The one person Walter never expected. That night, Elias sat at the kitchen table long after dark, the custody hearing less than 12 hours away. Jacob stared into the fire across from him, and eventually Elias asked about the boy's mother, whether she had ever written letters. Jacob froze. A memory appeared on his face, something important, and before Elias finished asking what it was, Jacob was already on his feet. His mother's box. His father had hidden it after she died, in the barn. Both of them were moving immediately, lanterns in hand, snow crunching beneath their boots, Jacob running straight to an old storage chest in the rear of the barn. Inside were photographs, receipts, family papers, and at the very bottom a stack of letters. Jacob pulled one free, then another, his eyes widening. He handed one to Elias. The handwriting belonged to Walter Briggs. Elias read the first paragraph, then the second, then the third, and suddenly everything changed. This wasn't a friendly business dispute, this was blackmail, threats, coercion, months of it. Walter had been trying to force Jacob's father to sell the land, and when he refused, the threats had grown worse, much worse. "Is that good?" Jacob asked quietly, staring at him. Elias looked at the letters, then at the frightened boy, then toward the courthouse sitting dark across town. For the first time since finding the children, real hope appeared, because tomorrow wouldn't be Walter Briggs versus two scared children. Tomorrow would be truth versus lies. And Walter Briggs had spent so many years lying that he'd forgotten something important. The truth only needs one chance. And tomorrow, it was finally getting one. The courthouse was full before sunrise. Word had spread through Red Creek overnight, and by 9 o'clock every bench was occupied. Ranchers, shopkeepers, farmers, widows, teachers, even travelers passing through town. Jacob sat beside Elias, his hands trembling, while Emma held his arm. Neither child had eaten much breakfast. Fear had stolen their appetite. Across the room, Walter Briggs looked completely relaxed in his expensive suit and polished boots, wearing the confident smile of a man who expected to win, because he usually did. Judge Harrison entered, the hearing began, and Walter's lawyer spoke first for nearly 20 minutes. Responsibility, guardianship, stability, legal documents, family obligations, every sentence painting Walter Briggs as a generous businessman trying to help two unfortunate children. The performance was impressive, almost believable. Almost. When it was Elias' turn, Judge Harrison asked on what grounds he contested the guardianship, and Elias looked at Jacob, at Emma, at Walter Briggs, and answered, "Because he's lying." The judge frowned and called it a serious accusation. "It is," Elias replied. "Fortunately, I brought proof." For the first time all morning, Walter's expression changed, only slightly, but it changed. Elias handed the letters to the bailiff, who delivered them to the judge one by one. The judge read, then read again, his face darkening. The room remained completely silent as the whispers began spreading. Walter shifted in his seat, just a little. The judge looked up and addressed Walter directly, lifting a letter and noting it appeared to be his handwriting. Walter's lawyer objected, but the judge ignored him, continuing to read threat after threat, demand after demand, months of pressure and intimidation. The courtroom atmosphere changed, and people were no longer looking at Walter with admiration, but with suspicion. The first crack had appeared. Then came the second. Jacob walked to the witness stand on shaking legs, and Elias felt proud just watching him. Most adults would have been terrified, but the boy was 10 and still he walked. He swore to tell the truth and then told the story. The arguments, the threats, the land dispute, the fire, every detail. The courtroom listened. Nobody interrupted, nobody laughed, nobody doubted him. Then the judge folded his hands and asked the most important question of all: who had Jacob seen the night of the fire? The room held its breath. Jacob swallowed. "Walter Briggs," he said. Walter's lawyer jumped up immediately, but before he could finish his objection, a voice came from the back of the room, small, steady, unexpected. An elderly ranch hand stepped forward, someone the entire room recognized. Thomas Greer, Walter Briggs' former foreman. Walter's face went actually pale, the first real fear Elias had seen in him. Thomas removed his hat, his own hands trembling, but he kept walking straight toward the witness stand. He told the judge he had something to say, and when Walter ordered him to sit down, Thomas ignored him completely. 20 years of fear ended in that moment. He looked directly at the judge, then directly at Walter and said clearly, "I saw him. I saw Walter leave that farm the night of the fire." He reached into his coat, pulled out a small envelope, and handed it over. Payment records, signed notes, evidence. Real evidence. The kind of evidence that destroys lies. Walter realized it instantly. His confidence vanished. The mask finally broke. Then one person spoke, and another, and another. A store owner stood, a rancher stood, a widow stood, stories pouring out, threats, bribes, intimidation, years of silence ending in less than 10 minutes. Because courage spreads, just like fear, only faster. Judge Harrison finally raised his hand, restored order, and then came the decision. He looked at Walter Briggs for a long moment, then at Jacob and Emma, then at Elias. His voice was steady. "Custody request denied." Emma immediately burst into happy tears, and Jacob grabbed her hand. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am ordering a criminal investigation into the death of Mr. and Mrs. Turner." Walter Briggs sat motionless, defeated, for the first time in years. Maybe forever. The gavel struck, and the hearing was over. 3 months later, spring arrived. Snow melted, grass returned, and the Wyoming plains turned green once more. The farmhouse changed too. Laughter filled the rooms now. Small boots sat beside the door, and drawings covered the kitchen wall. Emma adopted every farm animal she could find, including 3 chickens, a goat, and a horse that clearly didn't want to be adopted. Jacob helped Elias repair fences, plant crops, and run the farm. One evening they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, the sky glowing orange and gold, Emma asleep inside after a long day, the farm finally peaceful. Jacob looked toward the horizon, then at Elias, and asked if he thought their parents would be okay with them staying. Elias looked out across the fields and answered honestly, "I think they'd be grateful." Jacob nodded, his eyes going misty, but he smiled anyway. After a moment he said quietly, "We stopped looking for family, because we found one." And for the first time since losing his wife, Elias Cooper no longer felt alone. The wind moved gently across the fields, the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, and at last everyone was home.